Good morning.
Morning.
We've got a few sermons this time of the year on Proverbs. Don't seem to preach very often from Proverbs, but it's chapter 19, verse 21. Many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand. Many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand. Well, that's short and sweet, and there's not much more I can add to that, so I think I'll go and sit down. You don't get off quite that lightly. There were 4 people named everybody, somebody, anybody, and nobody. There was an important job to be done, and everybody was sure that somebody would do it. Anybody could have done it, but nobody did it. Somebody got angry about that because it was everybody's job. Everybody thought that anybody could do it, but nobody realised that everybody wouldn't do it. It ended up that everybody blamed somebody when nobody did what anybody could have done. Did you follow that?
Yeah.
Turn on the TV or the radio, and we continually hear of harrowing stories of refugees fleeing war-torn countries, bombing of civilians, ruthless dictators stamping out any form of dissent, people trafficking and slavery, terrorism, grinding poverty, the persecuted church, and so on. The list goes on and on. I wonder if you've wondered, where is God in all this? Why doesn't he stop these bad things happening? Why doesn't he do something? It almost seems sometimes that God has created the universe, set it running like a clockwork mouse, and then gone on holiday. Well, perhaps God is not around to see these things. He must be pretty busy in heaven. But our theology tells us that he is omnipresent, which means he's all present. It means he's capable of being everywhere at the same time. His divine presence encompasses the whole of the universe. There's no place, there's no location where he does not inhabit. That's a pretty awesome concept to get your head around, isn't it? And we shouldn't confuse this with pantheism, which suggests that God is the same as the universe. It indicates that God is distinct from the universe, but inhabits the entirety of it. Well, if he's everywhere, perhaps somehow he doesn't know what's going on. But we know he's omniscient, which means he's all-knowing. He's aware of the past and the present and the future. Nothing takes him by surprise. His knowledge is complete, is total. He knows all that there is that can be known. So if he's there and he knows, well, maybe he can't really do anything about it. But he's our third omni here, omnipotent, which means all-powerful. God has supreme power. He can do exactly what he wants. He's not subject to the same limitations that you and I are. So if God is all-present, he's all-knowing, he's all-powerful, it still begs the question, why doesn't he do something? Well, my good friend, the Apostle Paul, said in a letter to the Romans that we're not in a very good position to even begin to question God. Now, I'm not renowned for being a massive fan of the Message version of the Bible, but it puts this point rather well. Who in the world do you think you are to second guess God? Do you for one moment suppose any of us knows enough to call God into question? Clay doesn't talk back to the fingers that mould it, saying, "Why did you shape me like this?" Isn't it obvious that a potter has the perfect right to shape one lump of clay into a vase for holding flowers and another into a pot for cooking beans? If God needs one style of pottery especially designed to show his angry displeasure, and another style carefully crafted to show his glorious goodness, isn't that all right? Maybe we're not in a very good position to even begin to understand God. A little further on in Romans, in chapter 13, Paul writes this, again from the Message. Have you ever come on anything quite like this extravagant generosity of God? This deep, deep wisdom. It's way over our heads. We'll never figure it out. Is there anyone around who can explain God? Anyone smart enough to tell him what to do? Anyone who has done him such a huge favour that God has to ask his advice? Everything comes from him. Everything happens through him. Everything ends up in him. Always glory, always praise. I'm sort of reminded now I've got young grandchildren that from a very young age children begin to ask the question, why? Why? Why this? Why do I have to go to bed now? Why can't I watch CBeebies for another hour? Why can't I have another ice cream? And then perhaps as they get a little older, why can't I dye my hair green and have a tattoo on my forehead? The answer, mummy or daddy knows best, works for a little while, but not very long. And the question why gets more persistent. And so we still ask the question of God, why doesn't he do something? Well, the answer that is generally put forward, of course, is that we have free will. In creating us just a little lower than the angels, God has endowed us with free will. It gives us the power of choice. It allows us to choose a particular course of action. If you have seen the film Indiana Jones and the Lost Crusade, they get to this cave and there's an ancient knight who is, I don't know, 1,000 years old or something, guarding the Holy Grail, and there's an array of cups. And of course one man chooses the shiny cup with all the jewels, and he says he chose poorly. This is after he explodes. And of course Indiana Jones chooses wisely. So we can choose poorly, we can choose wisely. So down through history, through our greed, through ambition, through pride, through ignorance, our self-centeredness, we've often chose poorly, which has resulted in wars, persecution and inequality, hunger and suffering. Yet we're still so quick to blame God for not doing anything. There's also a logic that goes, if God did something every time we chose poorly and prevented the bad consequences, then we would be reduced to mere robots, chess pieces on a world-size chessboard. We would be the puppets and God would be the master puppeteer. That clearly isn't the case. So does God have a policy of complete neutrality? A strict policy of non-intervention? Does he let us just get on with it, whatever the outcome? Go back to the reading, Proverbs. Many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand. We can devise all sorts of schemes and ambition, but the purpose, the will of God, will out in the end. But then I was wondering, well, how does that actually happen? How does that work out? If you look back through Scripture, through the biblical record, the act of creation itself was the purpose of God. And Adam and Eve's choice of a fruit was a poor choice, or unwise to say the least. And in the face of increasing corruption, God decided to blot out man, but saved a remnant through Noah. God decided to make a nation for himself and called Abraham, who he later tested with the sacrifice of Isaac. We read the story of Joseph and Jacob, and the Jews settle in Egypt. Moses is called out of slavery. Joshua succeeds Moses. David kills Goliath and helps establish the Israelite nation. Solomon rules with power and wisdom, but eventually the wheels fall off. Daniel stands fast in the face of adversity. Fast forward to the New Testament, and we have extraordinary individuals like John the Baptist. Ultimately, God himself becomes man. He steps out of eternity and into history and offers himself as the ultimate sacrifice for our salvation. That doesn't seem much like an absentee God who doesn't care. God is doing something in the world, but he's doing it through those who choose to follow him. The Old and New Testament figures and Christians down through the centuries since have sought to make a difference. God's purpose will stand. His grace, the salvation of mankind, the establishment of his church, the sharing of the gospel message, the second coming of Jesus, and a new heaven and a new earth. These things will be done. Freedom means we have a choice. If I can use a sports analogy, do you actually want to be on God's team? You can, of course, choose to be a fairly disinterested observer and sit on the sidelines. You can even choose to be on the side of the opposition. Or you can choose to humbly accept and embrace God's amazing grace, his love and his forgiveness, and strive to play your part in his purpose, however great, however small that might be.